Okay, can you hear that? All right, I don't project that well. So I was just saying, it's very easy to download software to do your own meta-analysis, so you're going to see a whole lot of these papers coming out. And as a matter of fact, when people do their own RCT, it is customary to review the data in great detail. And at that point in time, you're pretty much ready to do your own meta-analysis. And that's essentially what I recently did. I did a study, an RCT, to look at the effect of a community health worker intervention on the control of diabetes. And when I finished my study, our findings were borderline significant. So I just meta-analyzed my data with everything else that was in the literature, and I published that meta-analysis more recently. So this is not that hard to do. But the idea for you guys is to understand why we need them, what the usual format is, what to look for to make sure that it's a good quality meta-analysis, and how to interpret the data. So it is very hard to remain up to date with so many different clinical trials coming out all the time. Sometimes you have one single huge landmark study that changes the way we do things, but more often than not, you will actually see a whole bunch of small or medium-sized RCTs with different results. Some of them will be positive, some of them will be negative, and you want to know whether those conflicting results in some way actually make sense when you put them together. So a good systematic review actually looks at all data available and, if possible, performs what we call a meta-analysis. So sometimes the data are so different from all the different sources that you can't meta-analyze the results, but you can still do a systematic review. So this is the distinction. You can only proceed to do your meta-analysis if the results are homogeneous enough. Sometimes you have to stop because they really seem to be indicating different effect sizes, different results, and you can just do a systematic review. So all meta-analysis include a systematic review, but not vice versa. And this is important to take into consideration. The gold standard for meta-analysis are the ones performed by the Cochrane collaboration. Many other people are doing excellent meta-analysis, and we all follow pretty much the same methodology, but the people who actually have pioneered in this field and put together the methodology that most people use were the Cochrane collaboration people. And when you are looking for data, if you find a Cochrane collaboration meta-analysis that answers your question, that's the best case scenario, because you can be certain they did a very good job at looking in all the right places and making a good effort at analyzing the data. So if you find that a Cochrane collaboration meta-analysis recommends a specific treatment for the condition a patient has, well, that's the best case scenario. There's little doubt that that may be the case. But regardless of where the meta-analysis came from, there are a few questions you need to answer in order to make sure that the meta-analysis is of good enough quality. The first one is pretty obvious, because if you don't have all the pertinent information, you're not going to have a good idea as to what's going on. So you need to make sure that the publication search is comprehensive enough. We're going to go over each item in subsequent slides. You need to make sure that there is no evidence of publication bias, that the studies you found are of good enough quality, that the populations and interventions were similar to the one in your patient's case. You want to make sure, as I already mentioned, that there isn't too much heterogeneity. It means that the results are similar enough so that they can be pulled together into a single estimate. And we're going to talk a little bit about whether people use fixed versus random effects models to pull their data. There is no need to actually understand how it is computed, because the software does it for you. What's necessary is to understand the rationale behind picking one or the other. And then you're going to look at the results, where you're going to see what the pooled estimates are. And you may want to know whether those results continue to be significant or not, as the case might be, across different types of analysis, when you analyze the results within subgroups, or when you change assumptions and do something we call sensitivity analysis. And then finally, this is the crucial step. Once you get your result, what is the biological plausibility? How does it fit with the things we do? Does it make clinical sense, and what's the potential impact in terms of both patient care and societal implications. So publication search has gotten much, much easier, as you can expect, in the Google era. Just to tell you about my recent experience, I went looking in all the customary places for data for RCTs that were similar to my own study, and I found a whole bunch of them, but I decided, just because I wanted to run it by Google, and without even going to Google Scholar, I found 3 additional articles that were actually quite pertinent to my search that I hadn't found using the usual databases. So you can expect that Google essentially within 5 years at the most will probably be the way we're going to start our queries looking for data. And you can use natural language. Remember we discussed the difference between medical subject headings and natural language. Well, natural language just means you write a clear sentence of what you're looking for, and Google does a wonderful job finding data for you. Nevertheless, it's important to make sure when you're reading a meta-analysis, depending where it came from, you really need to ensure that they did a good search. And don't underestimate the possibility that somebody might have been selective in looking for data. Some people have an agenda for a variety of different reasons, and they may have overlooked an important trial that just happened not to go with their agenda. So you just need to make sure that that's the case. And there's the same way we have guidelines for RCTs, to design, conduct them, and publish them, which are known as the consort guidelines, like somebody who's getting married. We have the PRISMA guidelines for meta-analysis, and they're very useful. And one of the things they include is a flow chart where you clearly have to tell people how you got the studies you found. Actually, this is from my own paper, and this is the way you write it up. So this is actually before I updated it, I think, because this should include the Google findings I did. But anyway, it's got different steps. In the first step, you identify all potential studies, and then you want to screen them to make sure that they are actually pertinent to what you're looking for. In my case, I was looking at interventions made by community health workers, and they're commonly reported also in the literature by the Spanish name of promotores or promotoras, so I included that. In the English literature, they call them lay health workers, so I included that, and then health educators, which is a less specific term. And I got a whole bunch of results. Then I limited them to clinical trials, and then I wanted to limit it to diabetes. And I used all different types of words to describe glucose control and diabetes. So in essence, I ended up with 125 articles, and we had to read all of them, and we included only studies that were of randomized design. So that only left 9, and only 5 of them were included in the quantitative synthesis, in the meta-analysis. The other studies were reviewed in the systematic review of the data. So publication bias, this is actually extremely important. Hopefully in 10, 15 years from now, we won't have to talk about this anymore, but it is still a possibility. So basically, it's hard to publish your small study if your findings go against the current understanding of the pathophysiology or the way therapeutics work. In other words, when you have a negative study, people will look at you with very skeptic eyes, and particularly that will happen when you don't have enough statistical power. They'll say, well, you couldn't find an effect just because you didn't have statistical power. Or you found that the treatment we expect to cure people is actually killing people because your sample size is too small. You change a few events from one column to the other, your findings are gone, therefore I don't trust what you're reporting. So there's also another side to this, and that is it's easier to hide smaller studies. And in the past, when we didn't have widespread registration, we will have companies performing studies throughout the entire world. What using what we call copycat protocols. Essentially, they will go to a good investigator in New Zealand, another good investigator in Argentina, another good one in Canada, another good one in Massachusetts, and they'll say, I'll give you funding to do this small study in 100 patients, and this is the protocol. If you're okay with it, let's do it, and we'll reimburse you $350 per participant who finishes up the study. So that actually happened over the years, and what they will have is they will have a central database where the studies will come in, the study results will come in every Friday, and by Monday morning the statisticians will have analyzed over the weekend, meta-analyzed the data, and if they saw a good trend, they will tell people, oh, keep going, this is fantastic. If they saw a bad trend, they will tell, stop, your confidentiality agreement prevents you from discussing what's going on, and we're just going to go back to the laboratory to modify the molecule because we don't like what we're seeing. So what I'm telling you is essentially that if, for instance, they saw cases of liver failure, fulminant liver failure, or severe liver failure in different centers, actually they had previously ensured that the local investigators signed a confidentiality agreement, meaning that they couldn't release any results unless they had the agreement of the sponsor, of the funding party. And what that meant was that results, particularly awful results, were kept completely in the dark because the company just decided not to release them. Or you could have a negative finding showing that there was no effect, but they were selling the drug just fine because people assumed there would be an effect in that sense, and they didn't publish those results either. So registration, openness in terms of what you're planning to do, what patients you're planning to recruit, how you're going to analyze your data, all that has actually changed quite a bit. And it all started with something that happened during Bill Clinton's administration, which was the mandate to create clinicaltrials.gov. So in essence, clinicaltrials.gov is the place where people go and tell the world what they're planning to do. And no IRB nowadays will allow you to conduct your study unless you have pre-registration of your trial, and also you are going to tell the world when your study is going to be completed. So if you run a study and never publish your results, it will be red flagged. And the FDA will not accept data from any clinical trial unless it was pre-registered with clinicaltrials.gov. So that brought a whole lot of openness to this, and the Cochrane Registry of Clinical Trials in the UK is actually the equivalent of clinicaltrials.gov in Europe. But going back to publication bias, what happens when you don't publish studies that are showing negative results? Where if you have other positive studies of equally small size, but which are positive, getting published, you're going to get a biased estimate of efficacy. You're going to think that your treatment works better than it actually does. And this is a commonly seen plot, and I really want you guys to be familiar with this because you're going to see it a whole lot during your careers. And sometimes they won't include the graphic in the paper, but there will be a sentence saying we performed funnel plots, and so no indication of publication bias. So essentially what you have on the vertical axis is some indication of sample size or the precision of your estimate, and they usually go hand in hand. Why? Because if you have a huge study with many events and then you estimate relative risks, you're going to have very narrow confidence intervals around the point estimate. You're going to be very sure about what you're seeing. So the vertical axis indicates either the precision of each one of the estimates or the actual sample size of each individual study. Each circle represents a study result, and this is the x-axis can be relative risk, can be hazard ratio, can be milligrams of deciliter for reduction in LDL cholesterol by a drug. It can be anything that measures therapeutic effect. And these three studies over here on top are the largest studies, and they're pretty consistent in terms of what they're showing. The effect size, when you go down to the x-axis, to the horizontal axis, they're all pretty much clustered around the same place. You see that? They're almost along the same vertical line. And that continues to be the case for medium-sized studies, and there's only dispersion at the bottom when the studies get really small. And this is something you really expect to happen. You expect to see random noise appearing when the sample sizes get small. So you have a tail going towards a greater effect size, and you have another tail going towards a smaller effect size. So usually we consider these more positive studies and these more negative studies, but the point is it looks like an inverted funnel, and that's the reason we call it the funnel plot. Okay? So again, there's greater dispersion among the smaller studies at the bottom of the plot. When you have publication bias, this is what happens. The smaller studies, the circles on this tail, disappear. Why? Because people didn't bother to submit their studies for publication, or because reviewers said, no, I don't trust your study result, you just don't have enough power, you need to conduct a larger study and come back to us. So the lack of this tail, a truncated funnel plot, actually shows that there is publication bias. And this is evidence of, this is a study published in the year 2000 where they showed that there was clear publication bias when people reported the risk of cancer after getting a barium enema. Those days, people were still thinking whether colonoscopy was indicated in everybody or not, and they were using barium enemas for patients who didn't want to have a colonoscopy, and they will report their results, and essentially there was a whole lot of bias. Negative studies suggesting that barium enemas did not work to predict the presence of colon cancer were not being published. So again, this is important because it's going to be a step 3 question, and it may also appear in some other tests. When you see something like this, truncated funnel plot, it means there is strong indication of publication bias. Okay? So when people don't include this graphic in the paper, they may say, we did funnel plots and there was no suggestion of publication bias. So there are limitations because there is an element of subjectivity. You look at the graphic and you say, yeah, it looks truncated. No, it doesn't. How many circles do you need to add over here to actually make it another tail and to make it completely symmetrical? So there have been many different methods developed over the years, and every statistician argues that his or her method is the best one. But the most commonly used method to look at whether there is publication bias or not is actually relatively one of the most simple, and that's Egger's test. What Egger did, he actually took this graphic and turned it on its side, making the, I'll show you. So now what you have is that measurement of precision or the sample size on the horizontal axis. It was previously on the vertical axis. And here you have the standardized estimate. How do you standardize an estimate? Well, for example, if you have a relative risk and it has a standard error, you just divide each relative risk over its standard error, and you'll get the standardized relative risk. So that's essentially what it means. You don't need to remember all the details. This is not something you need to memorize at all. I just want you to be familiar with what it is because it may show up quite frequently in different papers. So essentially what Egger did is he said, when I do this, when I get my standardized estimate, and here I got the precision, the denominator in both will be the standard error of the estimate, and when one trends to 0, the other will also trend to 0 if there is no publication bias. And of course, he wrote a beautiful theorem and a whole lot of formulas to prove his point. But the bottom line is, if there is no publication bias, the intercept here on the vertical axis will be on 0 or very near 0. So here you have circles that represent studies that show that there might be harm from the treatment. The ones that are close to 0, little benefit, and over here, much greater benefit. You see it's pretty much the same idea, just on a set of regression coordinates. And what circles disappear when you have publication bias? The ones suggesting that there is harm or there is very little benefit. So you lose the circles over here. What that does is that it moves the regression line because it was going this way before. Now you lose these points, so you pull it down, and now the intercept is no longer near 0. And that's essentially Egger's test. He tested whether this intercept differs significantly from 0 or not. Again, you don't need to remember all these details. I'm just mentioning them to you in case you ever find it and you wonder what it is. You can go back to your notes and you'll understand. So quality. This is actually quite important. Why? Because if you put garbage in, garbage will come out. So essentially, you need to make sure that the quality of the studies you're including in your meta-analysis is actually decent enough. And you guys know where it all begins. It begins in randomization. And I mentioned the fact that we make a whole lot of stress on the fact that randomization needs to be performed in an automated manner, that nobody should know what's going on. Nobody should manufacture randomization results. So we call that allocation concealment. It means that it's concealed from the investigators. It's completely independent from human beings, and once a participant is assigned to a treatment arm, that cannot be changed. So you want to make sure that each study you identified actually had something like allocation concealment. Then you want to know if the study is relatively small, that the characteristics at baseline are equally well distributed, meaning that there is no confounding. Remember I mentioned the other day that if you have a mega study, if you have a huge RCT, there will never be confounding. You'll be sure that all characteristics are almost identical when you compare one group to the other. But if you have a smallish study, if you have sample sizes of less than 500, for example, you may have imbalances and they may create confounding because those variables may be associated with the outcome at the end of the day. So you need to look at the post-randomization table and look at the results and make sure randomization actually worked. Was there double blinding? This is pretty self-explanatory, where investigators and participants blinded in terms of the treatment assignment. Then, of course, things that will lower your power are losses to follow-up and people crossing over, going from one treatment arm to the other, and you want to make sure you don't have too many of those. Intervention fidelity is very closely related to crossing over from intervention to placebo if it's a placebo-controlled study, but it just means was the intervention performed as planned. If you planned to give them 300 milligrams of the drug BID for 6 weeks, did they actually take that dosage? Were they able to complete the 6 weeks or not? Or did a whole bunch of patients just take QD because they hated taking BID medications? We call that intervention fidelity. Then the next item is to make sure that people who looked at the outcome, people who said, yes, the patient had a stroke, or no, the patient didn't have a stroke, actually did it in a way that's completely blinded, meaning they have no idea as to what the treatment assignment was, and that they used validated criteria. They can't just make up their own criteria to say whether it's a stroke or not. We have consensus as to how a stroke should be diagnosed, and the ascertainers, the people looking at outcomes, should be using those criteria. And finally, you need to make sure, as always, that they applied the intention to treat principle in analyzing the data. Why? Because you want to avoid manipulation. Again, intention to treat just simply means analyze as randomized. You get randomized to a treatment arm, and regardless of what treatment you actually took, at the end of the day, if you had an event or didn't have an event, it doesn't matter. You get analyzed in the arm to which you were originally assigned. Analyze as randomized. That's intention to treat principle. And finally, sometimes if you have imbalances after randomization in a smaller study, you may need to make adjustments for that, and you can do a multivariate analysis. And we mentioned that the Cox proportional hazards model is the one mostly used by RCTs when you have imbalances after randomization. So this is actually something that the Cochrane collaboration generated, and it's actually pretty useful because in some instances we actually create tables in which we describe what's correct and what's wrong about each one of the studies for each one of the important characteristics. But this makes it much easier for the reader to get a quick impression as to whether the situation is good or not. So essentially, each cell will be green if it's okay, yellow if it's not reported, and red if it was performed the wrong way. So here you can see that when it comes to doing randomization in this specific example, in this meta-analysis, all the studies did a wonderful job at randomizing. However, when it came to reporting allocation concealment, some studies did not even say whether they did it properly or not, and some studies obviously did not conceal their allocation. And the other one that actually has quite a bit of trouble in here is the presence of attrition bias, loss of outcome data in a huge proportion of the individual studies at more than 6 weeks in this specific example. So this actually gives you a very quick visual impression as to how good or bad the situation is, and then you can go in and read about the details if you're interested. This is another way of doing the same thing. It's just each cell represents what happened for that characteristic for each one of the individual studies. So you start by looking for data very carefully. Then you look at the quality of the individual studies, and if you're satisfied that the quality is good enough, you may decide to proceed with your analysis. When you get to that point, when you're ready to put all your data together into a single pooled estimate, you need to make sure you're not comparing apples to oranges. And therefore, you want to look at whether the results, the individual study results, are homogeneous or not. So this is what we mean by testing for heterogeneity. You will hear this expression, and you will be given results, and people will say there was low enough heterogeneity so we can pull the data. So remember, they're not referring to heterogeneity in methodology. They are not referring to heterogeneity in dosage of the drug. They're not referring to heterogeneity in terms of for how long people were followed up. All that was already in the previous steps. All that was in the homework. At this point in time, the decision was already made that the studies are similar enough and of good quality enough to be included in terms of methodology. Now they want to know whether the results are also similar enough. So when anybody says, what are the tests for heterogeneity, you can say they are testing homogeneity in study results, meaning the relative risk for death, the hazard ratio for stroke, something that the investigators, the individual investigators, estimated to look at the therapeutic effect in each trial. So many different statistics have been created to look at this. The most commonly used one, because it makes intuitive sense, is the I-squared. So if you pick up in New England, most of the recent meta-analysis in the New England will actually report the I-squared. And we like it because it represents the percentage of variability that's real. So the lower the I-squared, the more homogeneity you've got, okay, the lower the heterogeneity will be. And the higher the I-squared, the greater the heterogeneity will be. So we usually break it down into categories just to make it a little simpler, and we say that if your I-squared is less than 25%, you are doing just fine, meaning the results are pretty homogeneous, that there is very little heterogeneity, and that's actually good. When you are between 25 and 50%, that's okay. That's where many meta-analyses actually happen to be, and there is some heterogeneity, but it's not lethal. And the issue is when you have 50 to 75%, then you really need to explain what's going on. You need to go back to the drawing board. You need to look at the quality of the individual studies. You need to review the inclusion-exclusion criteria to make sure that the populations were actually similar to each other. You need to look at the settings. You need to look at the investigators. Sometimes even the country where the study was conducted actually makes a difference. And there are all sorts of different statistical methods that people can use and graphic displays of data that will try and identify the source of heterogeneity. But from the point of view of the reader, of you guys and myself, when I'm reading a meta-analysis, is, well, if I am between 50 and 75% of I-squared, if I don't get a good explanation as to where that came from and how they dealt with that, I'm not going to be putting a whole lot of confidence on their results. So when you have an I-squared greater than 75%, you have too much heterogeneity. There is no good basis for a meta-analysis. You can just do a narrative review of your data, but you shouldn't pull your data into a single estimate. So now, if you get an I-squared less than 25%, for example, and you're satisfied that everything is just okay, you're going to put your data together. And as I said before, there are many user-friendly softwares that you can download for free that will meta-analyze data for you. So all you have to do is actually click on a box, and you will run either method. And some softwares actually run both and report all the results, and you need to pick the one you're going to use for your publication. And there are essentially two ways of doing this. One is called the fixed effect approach, and the other one is known as the random effects approach. The mathematics, the computing approach to getting one or the other are actually important, because they give you different sizes in terms of the confidence interval of the finding. The actual pooled estimate may be very similar for both, but the confidence interval will always tend to be much wider for the random effects model. Why? Because it assumes that there is some randomness in terms of the treatment assignment and the treatment effect size, and it will include that in your computation. And what happens when you have a wider confidence interval? Well, like for any other study, you may cross the line for null hypothesis, and you won't have a significant finding. And believe it or not, there is publication bias in meta-analysis. Reviewers will get much more excited if you give them a significant result with a p-value less than 0.05. So there's a natural tendency for investigators to abuse the fixed effect model because it will give you a narrower confidence interval. So where do they come from? Well, essentially, from a conceptual point of view, we do have this distinction in many fields in statistics. And when you deal with a fixed effect approach, you're essentially saying, I am quite certain, I'm quite satisfied that I'm looking at the same treatment on very similar populations over and over again. So, for example, we frequently use statins, lipid-lowering drugs, after a myocardial infarction. So if you are doing a meta-analysis and you're lucky enough to find 25 papers that report the use of rosuvastatin, which is the most efficacious of all the statins, at maximal doses, started within 1 week after a myocardial infarction, then you're going to be pretty sure that you're looking at similar populations and the effects should be similar, and therefore that will be a fixed effect situation. Now, in reality, quite often what you have is something that doesn't look like that, and you have many different investigators using different drugs. Some investigators may use simvastatin, which is not a powerful statin. Some people may use pravastatin, which is a medium potency statin. Some people may use atorvastatin or rosuvastatin, which are highly efficacious statins. And they may use them in their maximal dosage or not. And they may start it within 48 hours of the myocardial infarction or after 2 weeks of the myocardial infarction. So what I'm trying to say is that when you have so much heterogeneity, it is quite likely that there will be some randomness in terms of the results. You're not looking at exactly the same study being conducted in the same population over and over again. In that situation, from a biological perspective, you need to ask for a random effect analysis. Also, the other prerequisite is that obviously if all the results are indicating the same type of efficacy, the relative risk or the hazard ratios should be very similar. And that will give you very low heterogeneity. So from a practical standpoint, if you're going to accept a fixed effect model from a meta-analysis, you need to make sure of two things. Number one, that heterogeneity was low, that the I-square was less than 25%. And number two, or less than 50% at the very at the most. And number two, that biologically it makes sense to do that. That when you look at the interventions, they are similar across different studies. So once again, the reason why people tend to abuse the fixed effect model is because it tends to give you a narrower confidence interval. It looks nicer. It's easier to get a significant result. It's easier to publish your paper. And you shouldn't underestimate the pressure that many people feel to publish more and more papers. And you as a reader should remember that if anybody used a fixed effect model, you need to make sure that it was low enough heterogeneity, meaning an I-squared statistic less than 25%. So this is just repeating what I just said. When you use the fixed effects model, you're assuming that there is a single common or fixed effect underlying every single study, and you're using essentially the same drug in every study, the same dosage in the exact same patient population. And the practical implication of that is that your I-squared needs to be at least less than 50%, optimally less than 25%. The random effects model make no assumption that the treatment is identical. Actually, it includes the possibility that there may be slightly different from each other and allows for the presence of random error plus some inter-study variability, resulting in wider confidence intervals. So in this case, studies tend to be weighted more equally, but relatively more weight is given to smaller studies as compared to the fixed effect model. Finally, you may read in many meta-analyses that people did sensitivity analysis. And this is one of many examples when understanding what it means actually takes away the scary component of the fancy terminology. So essentially, sensitivity in statistics means you change one variable, you change one assumption, you exclude one group of people, and you repeat your analysis. You change one particular thing, and you repeat your analysis to see whether it makes an impact or not. So in meta-analysis, we frequently want to know whether any given characteristic of the individual studies is associated with a difference in study results. So, for example, you may have a multi-center study being performed all over the world, and you start to get your results, and at the end of the day, it really looks like the centers in a given country are giving you an effect size estimate that's much larger than everybody else's, meaning the treatment seems to work better for them than for everybody else. Well, then you may want to examine what's going on doing a sensitivity analysis, meaning you may analyze the data for everybody, including the centers from that country, and then you take centers from that country out and you see if that makes an impact on your effect size estimate. If it changes your point estimate, then you need to ask yourself, is this real? What's going on here? What happened? What made the results so different at that particular country? Is it okay for me? Is it ethical for me to analyze those results together with everybody else's, or should I report them separately in different tables? And you can just tell the world the reason I decided to do this is that when I run my sensitivity analysis, the results really changed a lot, and I don't want to mislead the readers. So the example in the slides has to do again with statins, and this is an example of sensitivity analysis. We find 25 studies of the efficacy of Rosuva, which is Crestor, to lower the risk of major cardiovascular events when started right after an acute coronary syndrome, meaning myocardial infarction or unstable angina. And 5 of the studies were somewhat lower quality because they had losses to follow up in both arms. And the overall I-square is 54%, so it's heterogeneous, but it's not lethal. It's not greater than 75%, and we decided that it's appropriate to proceed. So when we pull the individual results into a single meta-analytic estimate, we do it twice. First, without those 5 lower quality studies, and then with those 5 quality studies. And these are the results we get. The pooled relative risk in the first run is 0.75. In the second run is 0.84. The confidence intervals are actually including the other point estimates, but the point estimates are actually clinically different. So it is pretty obvious that including studies with worse follow-up rates will bias our effect in terms of towards the null, meaning underestimating the effect size. So excluding them will be okay, or reporting both findings. Yeah.
It's underestimating the effect size versus the other one overestimating?
Well, no, you don't know, so you're probably better off publishing both and telling the world, I suspect that the lower quality studies, because of the lower quality, are not giving me the best possible result. And the relative risk here is showing a 25% relative risk reduction, whereas in this case you only get 16% relative risk reduction. So if you just show the world the analysis with every study in there, including the lower quality studies, you may be underestimating the actual effect size. So I don't know if I answered your question, but essentially the lower the quality of the study, the less confidence you put in the results. And in this case, there seems to be greater efficacy when you exclude them as compared to when you include them.
Seems like that introduces bias, because had they had a similar effect size, you would have included it and then narrowed the confidence.
Well, yeah, sometimes the problem is that you actually should not include lower quality studies systematically. So essentially, that's why we do sensitivity, and most people will report both. And it's up to the reader to make a decision which one you believe to be the true one. Yeah. So I don't know if you guys follow that. Is it clear? Okay. So there's something else that's more sophisticated you can do, and that is meta-regression. Again, no need to understand how it's actually conducted. What matters is to be familiar with the concept. So in meta-regression, what you actually do is you see whether the effect size from each study is associated with any given characteristic for those studies. And this is actually more sensitive to tell you whether things change because of the results change depending on some characteristic of the population, for example, or depending on the intensity of the intervention, or depending on the standard of care at each specific site. So for any of those things, you can stratify your findings. You can give point estimates for each category, for each type of site, for each quality of intervention, or you can use meta-regression. Using meta-regression is actually more sensitive. For example, there's this meta-analysis looking at vitamin E supplementation, and it showed a non-significant trend towards higher mortality, meaning the p-value did not go below the usual threshold of less than 0.05, and we wonder whether there's an association between vitamin E dosage and mortality risk. So when you do this, what do you see? It's a little blurred, but this is the dosage. The vitamin E dosage goes up for each study, and this is the all-cause mortality risk difference between one arm and the other. So towards here, the risk difference showed higher risk of mortality on vitamin E. Towards here, below zero, vitamin E lowered mortality. And the size of the circle represents the size of the study, the number of participants in study. So what is that showing? As the dosage goes up, the risk of dying from vitamin E actually increases. So if you perform a whole lot of smallish studies, you may say, well, if you want to take vitamin E, do it. There's no harm in doing that. But if your patient is taking high doses of vitamin E, that may actually be quite detrimental to them. Okay? So if you stratify the results, you may not see this right away, but the meta-regression actually captures that right away. In my own meta-analysis recently, what I did is I looked at whether baseline glycemic control was predictive of how efficacious the intervention was, because you expect people who come with very poorly controlled diabetes to respond better to any type of intervention. So essentially what we did is we randomized them to standard of care or getting help from a community health worker. And essentially I meta-analyzed studies that looked at similar interventions, and then I did a meta-regression. I included the mean baseline A1C. A1C reflects glycemic control. The higher the A1C, the poorer the control of your diabetes, and it was pretty clear. Studies with higher baseline A1C for their participants had a greater efficacy estimate. So community health worker interventions may work better when you have people with poorly controlled diabetes, but they won't have much of an impact if somebody comes to you with an A1C of 7.5 or 8%, which is only mildly elevated. So that's it. Do you have any questions? Okay, very good. We'll go over basic stuff when we do the review session. So you guys know that we have a review session before the test. And, again, the idea of this course is not to torture you with the test. The idea is to just give you the tools to be comfortable with journal articles. So nothing that was not discussed during the talks and or discussed during small group sessions will show up in the test, okay? There will be no surprise items. We do have one bonus question because I want to know how well people are doing. There's one specific question. You'll know when you take the test which one it is. But if too many people failed that question, we just take that out of the score estimate. Don't worry about that. Because the reason for the question is not to score you guys, but to let us know how well we're doing in terms of, educating you about complex issues. Thank you. Promoting Kathy to assist. That's good. So that's why people prefer both, because you can expect people who publish other studies, they're much excluded for quality, will argue with you and will be a never-ending conversation. So you preempt that by saying, okay, I review your paper, and in terms of the findings for the partner collaboration, this is how well you publish in your paper. And some people, actually I got letters from people after my meta-analysis came out saying, oh no, I think I did a good job, and you just didn't really enjoy the work. And, it's like never ending, and you have to go to the referee to say, oh yeah, it's a fair representation of your method. But the point is, why are you doing money? You have free oh, really? But,
Inspired by you.
So the meta regression, it's just a regression. So you just take the relative risk for each study, and you regress that on some characteristic you think is associated with that relative risk. So in their case, bottom you need those. But they include every study in it. In sensitivity analysis, you're going to say, wow, I don't believe the results from the lower dosage studies, and I want to take them out, and I want to see what happens. And then you say, wow, when I take out the lower dosage studies, my relative risk is just that is high mortality. And then you report both to the world. But when you do that, there's always some sense of, oh, I don't know what that really means. Should the studies be in there or not? So sensitivity analysis are usually not that definitive. When you give people a plot like that, and you show that mortality goes up as the vitamin E dosage went up, there's very little to argue.
What's the difference between this meta-analysis?
No, meta-regression is a method within a meta-analysis.
Right. Oh, okay.
And they just call it meta-regression because it's a regression done for meta-analysis.
Oh, okay.
It's just a regression.
So it's a regression
Yeah, that's the question, because your colleagues may be having the same. I'll bring it up during the review.
Is that your jacket?
Yeah, I'll take it.
Okay.
All right.
Do you take the person that's sleeping there too, or?
We usually let them wake up on their own time.
Okay.
Or maybe they use their first college.
Let's see.
That's sad. Pick up your own student.
I know.
My class is done.
That's kind of just kidding, but really serious. He was from the last class. There we go.
It almost makes it seem like the guy would take offense to us saying
Okay. Why is it giving me all of these things?
Okay, this says about.
Okay.
Do you want me to put it down right now?
Yeah.
I think this is down. This one goes just. This is down.
Oh, that's as much as it goes to?
Because the won't go
Really?
down anymore.
Oh,
Yeah, you can go up. Go down.
okay.
I think because you can see it in this classroom from far away.
I can. But, okay, so.
Do you want to keep these?
Yeah. So what did you do last time to bring up, there's one, I think I had one, what do you call it, YouTube thing.
Oh, do you want to get it started up? And then you
Yeah.
can just like go out of the thing.
Here it is. So should I click on it there? See, it's not.
It's not hyperlinked, so it won't work.
Okay.
So I'll just put it into a YouTube.
Okay.
What is
Figure let him have a British guy talking instead of me.
Okay, so then it's just for you to go use to get out of when you just get out of your PowerPoint.
Just go there.
Yeah.
Okay.